Good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good midday, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Friends of Korea webinar series. We're very excited today to have Elise Hu, former reporter from NPR, is going to be talking about K-beauty. And if you've spent any time in Korea and you've seen all the advertisements on the subways and the buses about plastic surgery and how to make yourself more beautiful, I think you'll be very interested in tonight's topic. So Jenna Gibson is going to, in a few moments, introduce our speaker. And just remember, if you enjoy these kinds of programs, you can give the gift of membership, friendsofkorea.net. Our membership rates are very reasonable. And take it away, Jenna.
All right, good evening, everyone, or good morning here from Seoul. I'm extremely excited that we have Elise, who's going to be talking with us today. As Jerry mentioned, she is a journalist. She's based in Los Angeles. She hosts a podcast, an entrepreneur. She's a very accomplished speaker, so I'm very excited to have her here today. Elise spent nearly a decade at NPR as a regular voice on flagship shows, All Things Considered and Morning Edition. She was based in Seoul for quite some time, which I believe inspired a lot of this book, and we'll talk to her a lot about that. So in the book, Flawless Lessons in Looks and Culture from the K-Beauty Capital, Elise Hu takes the business of appearances seriously, exploring the way performing beauty is built into our political system, our economic system, our labor system, our media, especially social media, and ourselves. It asks, where do we draw the line on physical improvement when a technological gaze makes it so promising and possible?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm so
Yes, we
excited
can
to be
hear you.
here. Sorry, I'm running a little bit late. You can see me and hear me okay?
Yes, we're good.
Great, fantastic. Well, I'm guessing the introductions have already happened, so I'll just make some brief framing remarks and then open it up to questions from the group. Thank you so much for having me. The best part, I think, of the process of writing a book, because so much goes into it, and I think that this has been, what, a 3-year-long process. Jenna knows, because she was one of my many sensitivity readers. The best part and the most rewarding part has been actually putting it out into the world and getting to talk about it, because being alone with my thoughts and having to research and write and revise was absolutely excruciating. But you know from the general introduction that I sought out to look back on my time in South Korea as bureau chief in Seoul in a more comprehensive way. And I thought that a book was the best way to tie a bunch of sweeping ideas together. One was sort of my own personal experience of not completely feeling welcome in my body when I occupied space in Seoul because of the really prevailing beauty ideals that are largely driven by media and entertainment and advertising and the exporting of a lot of K-pop ideals. But then also reckon with what was happening on the ground for Korean women domestically in 2018, when I was busy covering national security matters, because that was the year of the Pyongyang Olympics and the Moon Kim summit at Panmunjom. And I think that was the year there was a North Korean defector who crossed over at the border. And then there was also the Trump Kim summit in Singapore. All of that happened in the first half of 2018. And it was just this whirlwind experience. But what I didn't get to cover because of all of the North Korea news was the largest women's rallies, women's rights rallies in South Korean history. At one rally, there were 30,000 women, then 50,000, then ultimately by September of 2018, that is, something like 90,000 women rallying for more equal rights in South Korea. And I just felt like it was unfinished business for me, not only as another Asian woman, but also as a reporter who was really trained on trying to shed light and bridge differences and help build understanding between one part of the world and another. I feel like I really missed that story and how it was actually tied into the experience of all of us. So ultimately, Flawless explores a lot of that. And there's the history of the rise of Korean beauty. There's also how much it's tied into the Hallyu wave and the explosion of K-pop, K-film, K-drama that we're seeing, because these are largely visual exports. And when you're exporting visuals, you're also exporting certain standards and ideals. And I think that that gets overlooked because it's really hard to measure like how many more people are wearing their eyeshadow a different way or starting to wear cream blush instead of powder blush. But South Korea is in so many ways leading the rest of the world now in terms of aesthetic trends. And when I was growing up as an Asian person in St. Louis and then Dallas, I remember always aspiring to kind of whatever I was seeing in the media, which was like Elle Macpherson and Nikki Taylor and a certain kind of bleached blonde, blue-haired, skinny white woman. And now I think it's really rather refreshing to see crossing over culturally happening in the other direction. And so Flawless also explores that alongside some of the more constraining elements of having to be a woman and an ongoing gender war in South Korea domestically. And it takes all of those things seriously. So hopefully that's a good kind of starting map of a lot of the different directions that we can go. Jenna, you have read an uncorrected version of the book. I think Ekaterina has a copy and has gotten into it a little bit, but not only do I want to take your questions, I'd love to hear questions from the group because we are all friends of Korea.
Awesome, perfect. So I have a couple questions to start off, and then we'll throw it to the audience. As you just mentioned, obviously you weren't able to focus on this, perhaps as much as you would like to, focusing on other pretty big priorities at the time. So when you were in Seoul, or even later on, was there a specific moment when you had this like realization, like, oh, I need to write a whole book about this?
I've never wanted to write a book. So first of all, I just want to say, I'm a broadcast journalist. I'm so used to writing in 3 to 8 minute segments and to think about things in that way. The first pieces of journalism I've ever written were always broadcast scripts. They were television scripts and then radio scripts. And then occasionally I'll write articles for print publications. And so the dream or the goal of writing a book never really spoke to me. But I just thought, I think it was really after I got home, Jenna, to be honest, that I thought this is a book. And it's because, and for those of you who have a copy of it, there is so much that is actually wrapped up into the experiences of sort of not only like our bodies as women, but also the moment that we live in when it comes to technology and a visual and virtual society. And so I didn't think that I could, in a series of podcast episodes even, really cover the breadth of all the ways that these topics are tied into each other. For example, let's see if I have a copy of the book in front of me. I mean, there is a chapter on ajumas and what ajumas teach us. There's a chapter on just the history of powders and serums and things like that have come out of K-beauty. But there's also a chapter on, there's a few chapters on the plastic surgery industry, but how that is tied to war and colonization and the roots of sort of the ways that transnational history and geopolitics are tied into our bodies and how we shape our aesthetics. And so it jumps all over the place in a way that hopefully coheres because my story, my personal narrative goes across it. But I just really didn't think that I would really even be able to scratch the surface unless I looked at it comprehensively in an 80,000 words. So ultimately, that's what it is. Sorry in advance.
So, I mean, that's one of the things you just mentioned, that you have your personal story that flows throughout, and then you pull out aspects of that and dig into it in a more, reporting kind of style. So how did you balance that, your personal experiences, your background, even your family? I mean, you talk about your daughters a lot.
Yes.
How do you
Everybody
balance
gets to know them.
that? Yeah, exactly, right. So how do you balance the personal and the kind of reporting in this book?
You know, as a journalist, we are often trained, or in the way I was trained as a journalist, because I was in college 20 years ago now, was to really be impartial and just to be the observer. And this book is different in that it comes from a perspective, and my perspective is baked in. And I actually think it serves this particular journey, because I wouldn't have had the questions that I had without coming at it from as a woman, as an Asian woman, as a former teen model, where I was kind of stigmatized by for my looks, you know, or I was judged based on my looks at a very young age. But then also when I was in Korea, I gave birth to 2 more daughters for a total of 3 daughters. And so my personal story and my concern about the next generation and how they would get to occupy space and move about the world is all tied into it. And so I took, as an example, as somebody who I really admire, Peggy Orenstein. She's written 2 nonfiction books that really weave narrative with a bunch of reporting. Because had I written a completely impartial book that just jumped into topics like history and philosophy and technological theory, then I think that it would have been a difficult read, I think, just to get through. And it helps to kind of have real people and their voices and their experiences in there. And my experiences often informed a lot of the questions that I asked. One of the animating questions in Flawless is, where do we draw the line on improvements to our faces and bodies when we are sold so many solutions and so many technological or medical advances are available to improve ourselves? What I found in South Korea again and again was problematizing a thing. So a lot of South Koreans would notice my freckles. I have freckles. I always have sun damage. And they would say, ooh, freckles, why don't you fix that? Or there's a place, why don't you go to this dermatologist to fix it? So it was sort of like, if the solution, if the advancement has happened to remove the freckles or to solve this problem of yours, then logically, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? And so, but then that raised kind of bigger questions like, why do I have to? And where do we draw the line? Because increasingly, we can change everything about ourselves. I mean, very famously, there's the jaw shaving, the jaw breaking surgery in order to establish more of a V line. And so my narrative was key, I think, in laying out this particular journey, just because so many of the questions came from it. And also, I just thought it would be more engaging. And then the final part of my answer about that is I didn't want as much memoir in it as it wound up being, but this was a bit of a pandemic hack. So when I sold the proposal for Flawless, it was March 2020, the last meeting at Penguin Random House before everybody had to go home and start working from home for an interminable amount of time. And none of us knew that at the time. So when I originally envisioned the book, I envisioned me being in Seoul for long periods of time to do more reporting on the ground than I was able to do. But ultimately, I did get back, but for a shorter amount of time than I wanted, and after much bureaucracy, because I had to get the exemption from the quarantine, because South Korea had the 14-day quarantine exemption for a long period. So inserting more memoir as a way to get into the stories is replacing the voices of some South Korean women who I had planned to follow for many months at a time that I wasn't able to do because of lockdown.
So going back to this idea that you had planned to write about this, or you were thinking about it, or you had had these experiences when you were living in Korea, I guess I'll say, having these experiences. We talked a little bit before you got here about living in Seoul and just subconsciously being inundated with a lot of this messaging, right? And not necessarily noticing it or noticing it and thinking it's not affecting you too much, but potentially it is. Was there anything that you realized later on, once you had gone in and done the reporting and dug back into it, was there anything that surprised you that you didn't expect from when you had kind of just been observing it beforehand?
Yeah, I think my biggest transformation as an observer is when I first landed in Seoul, the very first neighborhood, this is just happenstance, the very first neighborhood I stayed in Seoul was Myeongdong, which all of you know, since you are Koreaphiles, is the makeup district. And especially in the mid-10s when all the Chinese tourists were going. Now it's really died down because of lots of factors, the pandemic, because of e-commerce, tensions with China after that. But in that year, it was the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, it was just flooded with Chinese tourists, and it felt like trick or treat, but for skincare samples. You know, you could just go around and people would just drop things into your bags of snail oil cream and essences and ampules and masks. And it was a lot of fun, you know, and I really find so much of and you'll see this if you get the book, I really vacillate between my own, the allure and how sumptuous I think K-beauty products can be, and then my discomfort at constantly having to do some work to improve myself, right? And so I happened to get dropped into Myeongdong, and my evolution was that night when I observed a lot of the selfieing, which wasn't happening as blatantly in the United States. And then when I observed a lot of the Chinese tourists who were wearing the nose covers and the bandages fresh from cosmetic procedures and surgery, I saw that as vanity. You know, I think I've never really seen post-op women before in the United States, because I think still that a lot of recovery happens behind closed doors. But here it was just recovery out in the open. It seemed like a badge of honor. And I thought, wow, this is so vain. And my big transformation happened over the years that I lived there, where I realized that it was just an economically, professionally, socially rational choice to have to do work on your body to try and improve yourself, because having good looks or better looks than you were born with is framed as a personal responsibility, a matter of personal responsibility. And if you fail, it's a personal failing. And even with regard to sort of mothers and daughters, mothers are sort of held responsible for their children's weight, or held responsible for their children's success. And success in life gets wrapped up into whether you look the part in order to get jobs or find a partner. And then so the work that you put into sort of helping your child look the best that they can gets coded as maternal love. And of course, these are not victimless crimes, because all of us end up collateral damage because we internalize ideas that if you're ugly or if you're fat, you know, whatever it is that seems out of vogue, that somehow it's a personal failing and that you can't be happy, which is something that ultimately I think that we need to break down and unlink, delink.
Okay, I have one last question, and then I think we can throw it to the audience, because I'm really curious what people want to know more about. Obviously, we're a group of people who are very interested in Korea, as are you. So can you tell us a little bit
I'm gonna join.
about yes, right. Welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about the K in K-beauty? What is there anything that is kind of uniquely Korean about this phenomenon?
Yes, I would describe it as natural ingredients. So a lot of the ingredient innovation you see, whether it's shark liver oil, whether it's mugwort, whether it's red ginseng, whether it's green tea, that's very much part of what makes K-beauty, and not European beauty or US beauty. The other is how quickly the R&D happens and then is able to churn out new products. So there were some folks in the industry who told me that you could come up with an idea for something and then get it on store shelves. So get it all tested and produced and the packaging made, and get it on store shelves within 6 weeks, which is like fast fashion, right? This is like how fast H&M or Zara work in order to get pieces of clothing onto store shelves. And so it's pretty astonishing how fast they can put out new products, market test, and have very meticulous data on how well they're doing, and then pull products that aren't performing very quickly. And then the changing of the form factors. So instead of having a powder blush, now we are all wearing cream blush. And the idea that you can change powder from its old format into now cream is also something that I think Korea really pioneered and deserves credit for. And then the cuteness, of course, the packaging, the products that are in little milk cartons, and all the Tony Moly lip balms that are in apples and peaches and pandas. That is, I think, a real calling card for Korean beauty.
Okay,
There's
so
more, of course, but I'll save it
of
for the
course,
pages.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I'm going to open it up to the floor. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function and I'll call on you. I'll go to our very own Ekaterina first.
All right. I really enjoyed reading your book. I thought, it was a great opportunity for me to reflect as well on the time I spent in Korea and, interaction with this behemoth that is, the beauty industry and the beauty standards that are there. But one thing that I thought a lot about while reading your book was both the technology aspect of it, as well as the role of women within the business themselves. You mentioned earlier that there's just kind of a quick turnaround, this entrepreneurial spirit. And, there's a lot of little companies that operate in the space and can, blow up if they have a really amazing ingredient or product. And I was wondering, in your research and in the people you've talked to in the industry, is this a big business opportunity for women in the space? Beauty is primarily considered an industry that focuses on women, and in a country where there's so many big conglomerates that run so many different aspects of the economy. Do you see this also as not just something that kind of women have to perform, but a place where they can also find entrepreneurial success?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we have to remember that the struggle is real when it comes to gender equality or inequality in South Korea. The gender pay gap, the women's labor participation rates, and the percentage of women in leadership positions, both politically and at the corporate level, are the worst among OECD nations. And I think that Korea's coolness abroad, especially with respect to pop culture, really masks the huge gender disparities that are happening domestically. And part of the reason why I wrote this book also was to sort of shed light on that, because I think that the Korean feminists are tremendously organized, impressive, and exceptional women, but don't get a lot of attention or don't get as much attention globally as they should. And so a bright light for the Korean beauty industry is that it allows for more women entrepreneurs to find success. Like, I profile Park Jung-eun in my book, who is the head of a lip balm line called Luos, which is Seoul spelled backwards. And she was able to raise money on the Korean equivalent of Kickstarter, Wadis. And now she has wound, for her original few lip balms, but now has many other products and lines, and was selected by Olive Young to be as part in the Olive Young online emporium. Of course, y'all know Olive Young and its dominance among South Korean skincare and makeup stores. So I do think it's really promising, and it's a great area for women entrepreneurs, not only in Korea, but also Korean American ones, to be successful. Because, we have seen SoCo Glam and Glow Recipe, and those Korean American women be really successful over here in the West. And so I think that's promising and great, and we should celebrate that. I just wish that it wasn't only in the industries that are considered like in women's industries, or considered beauty or soft. I'd love to see women in leadership sort of expand to more traditionally male-coded industry as well.
All right,
All right,
next
there
we'll
was
go
a
to
question.
Jerry.
Yeah, Elise, thanks very much. I'm looking forward to reading your book. And, I was thinking we have a diverse membership in Friends of Korea, and some people have been associated with a while back. They're Peace Corps volunteers, et cetera, and Fulbrighters and all this. And so I was there in Peace Corps in the 70s and, wandering around Korea, and I learned the importance of this public self, this public presentation. We have that, every society has that, but it was really emphasized, I felt, when I lived there, but the only Korean beauty products that I saw was Amore at that
Amore
time.
Pacific, yeah.
And I would see sometimes in unguarded moments, women would have cucumbers on their face, etc. That maybe started the natural beauty. So my question is, when I was wandering around there in the 70s, were there watershed moments that I was missing at all as far as K-beauty, or when did that happen?
You weren't missing anything because in the 1970s, especially because you were still under the uh, Park Chung-hee dictatorship at the time, right? Had he been assassinated yet? No, it
It
was
was
early
during,
19.
Yeah.
Okay, so
79,
during that
79.
period. So it was really the growth of the K-beauty industry as we know it today. The big turning point came in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when the Hallyu wave was cresting all over the region. In the early 90s, you were already seeing the birth of companies like Face Shop, Skin Food, Misha, some of the companies that you see on road shops when you go back and visit Seoul today, or as storefronts when you visit Seoul today. But in the 60s, 70s, especially under the US Korea relationship, so much was actually coming, so many US beauty products were coming into and being smuggled into South Korea at the time that it was desirable at the time to have something Western like Pond's cold cream. And while Amore Pacific traces its roots back to pre-war, so 1948 or so, it didn't really explode as a global company until the late 1990s, when you had the transmission of images of beautiful Koreans by way of K-pop, K-drama, K-film, that then served as a running advertisement for K-beauty and its practices.
All right, so please use the raise hand function if you have a question. But in the meantime, there's a question in the chat following up on something you mentioned with the speed of how these products get into market. How does the safety testing work for that? How can you get something turned around that fast? Is there some sort of, kind of FDA equivalent for that?
There's a health ministry and equivalent of FDA, but from what I understand, and I didn't get into a lot, there are some areas of the book that are underreported, if you ask me, now looking back on it a couple years on, and one of them is the regulatory process and the climate and how that allows for such quick development. But I do know that the FDA is seen by many companies globally, not just those on the other side of the Pacific, but also, here in North America or many countries, the FDA is seen as uniquely burdensome to get approval from. And as a result, one example of this is with neurotoxins like Botox, Juvo, Dysport. There are only 5 now types of neurotoxins that are available for injection and or as injectables here in the United States. But in Korea, it's something like 30 to 40 different kinds. And it's because of the regulatory climate being far more lax compared to the burdensome requirements of the US FDA. There's also more, I think, that dermatologists and med spas, places where you would get facials, are allowed to do procedure-wise than in the United States. So though in the United States, there are these like med spa gray areas, which is why you are seeing more drive-by Botox available in the US now. But so that is one area where I would have liked, I'm still curious about, and I'd like to know more about. And then the other is the environmental impact. So when we are consuming so much packaging, like what is the total cost of that? And I'd love to better understand that because, I talk about write about how aesthetic labor and doing all the work is really extractive of human capital, like of our time and our energy and of our money, our disposable income. But also we're in a time of, planetary peril. And so the cost, I think, on the environment is an area that I think needs more reporting.
All right, Danny, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful responses so far. And I'm glad earlier you mentioned kind of this OECD gender pay gap in South Korea. I'm just curious. So, because on the one hand, I totally agree that what you mentioned, how it is an act of vanity, but you also note how there's this other aspect, and you kind of hint at this in that because there's this gender pay gap, it systematically forces women to marry up, right? Heterosexual women have to find that high earning spouse, and to do so, you have to fit this like very restrictive kind of mold. And not only that, but it also kind of limits a woman's value to only her looks, right? So in many ways, it's incredibly misogynistic. It really de-emphasizes all the other skills that women can bring. And also kind of robs South Korea of a valuable workforce when women who could be doing creative work like being entrepreneurs in male-coded industries are instead reduced to kind of almost living dolls in a sense. So are you seeing more of a pushback? And then secondly, South Korea is going to need a more balanced gender participation in the workforce, given the increasingly low birth rate, right? So unless South Korea can boost women's participation, they're not going to be able to help their aging population. So in a lot of ways, I think this beauty industry, on the one hand, is it makes a lot of money, but then it has these side effects in that it marginalizes women's other roles. And then secondly, it also goes on to perpetuate the system that limits women's participation in the workplace as well. So I was wondering if you got a sense of like some of these feminist groups or feminist women that you were talking to, bringing attention to this and whatnot. And just for context, I'm a Korean historian who works on gender. So this is something.
Oh, great. Yeah. Where are you based? Fresno.
Okay.
State.
Yeah. So.
Oh, cool.
So obviously you're the expert on this topic here, but in terms of
I would love to visit one of your classes sometime.
Okay. Well,
we'll talk after.
Welcome. Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. We'll talk after. I think just +1 to everything Danny said. +1. I concur. He raised a lot of really important issues, and I actually have a line in the book that talks about how if things don't improve demographically, because the birth rate in South Korea is now less than 1 child per woman. It is the lowest in the world, even lower than Japan, which is famously already in depopulation. So unless things change and there is more gender equality in the country, and that women actually do feel like full-fledged citizens and not second-class citizens in South Korea, then South Koreans, I think, it depends on the calculus, because it changes each year, but South Koreans are going to go extinct by the year like 2730 or something. It's coming unless there is change. Obviously, climate disaster could destroy us all before then, but it is a very real concern, and all the efforts by the South Korean administrations to try and juice the birth rate have been top down and wholly ineffective. And that's because I think what's really necessary is cultural change and a real reckoning with the way that women's role in society has to be earned rather than assumed. And I felt that in all sorts of ways. I was the bureau chief for NPR in Seoul, but constantly, anytime I would show up at the Ministry of Defense or at various offices, the Interior Ministry, whatever it was, and especially since I was pregnant twice when I was in South Korea, I would waddle up and they would ask if they could speak to my boss or speak to my bureau chief, or ask me kind of these sexist questions or make sexist remarks like, what does your husband think about all of this? And, your husband, what a Superman for supporting you and your move to South Korea and all of these things. So I experience the sexism all the time, and the way that appearance intersects with that can't be ignored, because women, as Danny talked about, we are ridiculed for attempting to capitalize on appearance, because the Korean women get called Gangnam beauties, right? If they've had too much plastic surgery or whatever is viewed as too much plastic surgery, or they're called doenjangyos, which are women who care too much about superficial pursuits and only survive on doenjangjige, right? And yet they're ridiculed for trying too hard on the singular attribute that society encourages them to cultivate, but then even more ridiculed if they decide to opt out and not participate. Because there are Korean feminists who were empowered in 2018. There was the Escape the Corset movement, which many of you probably remember. There was hashtag, proof of discarded corset in Korean, in which women were cutting their hair, they were throwing away their makeup compacts, crushing them on camera. They were tallying how much time and how much money they spent getting ready each morning in order to look like that flawless, long-haired, well-made-up, feminine ingenue, and then just decided they weren't going to participate anymore. And those women are taking such a risky stand in South Korea because they are often bullied. They are accosted on the street. Their bosses give them a hard time. They are uninvited to family gatherings. Some have even been reportedly assaulted as a result of just not looking the part of a Korean woman. And so I do write about them. I find them exceptional. I write about them with great sort of admiration because they are using their bodies as a site of protest, right? They're refusing to participate in beauty culture at all. Ultimately, this isn't a polemic. I'm not saying that there should be a world where none of us wear makeup. There's so much that I do celebrate about aesthetics and being able to decorate ourselves if we want to. What I want and what I think progress would look like is if we could opt out and not without it exacting a cost for anyone. So if we could kind of get decorated and look like a K-pop ingenue if we wanted, and that would be one choice, but we could also not, and then not be uninvited to family gatherings. That's the kind of society that I want for my girls.
All right, let's go to Nita. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Hi, yes, Nita is correct. Thank you, Elise, for this talk, and also I'm so excited about your book now. So I haven't been to Korea in a hot minute. I was there like 10 years ago as like a fresh out of college grad. I was there on the Fulbright Korea, and so I was like one of the things, and so this is like early 2010s, and it was I grew up. I'm a 90s baby, so I grew up where I feel like in the U.S. at least, plastic surgery was definitely stigmatized. Like any celebrity that got plastic surgery, it was definitely pointed out, or it was like, often associated with like highly sexualized celebrities like the Playboy Bunnies, Pamela Anderson, things like that. And so it was definitely sort of this like, I feel stigmatized aspect of beauty culture in the US. And then over the time, especially more, I think it might have changed a little with the Kardashians. And then now, but now with this sort of like body positivity, body neutrality movement coming in, I think the stigma is still very much there. So when I went to Korea, I remember being shocked by those very advertisements in the subway that we were talking about earlier, and just how prominent it was and how public it was. I feel like, as you mentioned, it's any type of body modification in the US is still very much behind doors. It's like you only see the finished product. So just how public it was, and how, to some extent, how destigmatized and almost expected. I mean, I think as your book shows, it is. I had two questions. One is, during your extensive time in Korea, have you seen any changes in regards to this sort of relationship between perhaps like stigmatization or lack thereof and any type of body modification, whether it be full-on plastic surgery, whether it be things like the poor vacuuming, like participating in beauty culture? So has there been a change that you've witnessed regarding stigma in beauty culture? And then secondly, this is like a totally nerdy question because I'm a PhD student, and so I'm just kind of curious methodologically what challenges you had in writing this book, whether it be like accessing certain sources and just writing during a pandemic. And so I'm just kind of really curious about the process of writing, this really interesting book.
Yeah, I ultimately talk to, I think, gosh, I want to say upwards of 200 sources for this book. They didn't all make it in. In fact, a fraction of them made it in. And I always feel sort of sad, that not everybody gets to make it into the final product of anything I do, whether it's an article or a full-fledged book. But they ran, and when it came to the Korean women I spoke to, because I really wanted to center them and their experiences, because the story of this and the story of the experiences, especially for the feminists who are opting out, they should be telling the story. Like, this is their story to tell, and they do in Korean language. What didn't exist was something from from in English language from an American reporter's lens. And so I still am working with the Escape the Corset women to see if their books and their texts on their protest years can get translated into English, because I think that would be such an important addition to our understanding and our discourse. So the first question, have I seen any changes with regard to beauty culture? Actually, I worry that it's getting worse. There's less stigmatized, there's less of a stigma to getting work done. And it's more expected that you get work done because technology, especially in the form of injectables and lasers and those sorts of therapies, is now making cosmetic work so much less invasive. So the tricks to try and slim down your jaw, the work that would be required might previously mean actually breaking down the jaw and then reshaping it. But now you can just remove buccal fat, right? There's the buccal fat removal surgery. You can create optical illusions of elongating various parts of your body by injecting Botox into them. The second most popular place for Botox in South Korea is the base of the neck, the trap muscles, because if you get rid of this muscle or sort of weaken them, then it's supposed to make your neck look longer, and ditto with the calf muscles. So if you inject Botox in your calf muscles, then your legs can look skinnier. And I write a lot about how legs on a K-pop idol's body, on a female K-pop idol's body, have been really weaponized by the image makers, the Isumans, of SM, of Korea, in order to flex Korea's soft power. And so legs, bare female legs have gotten weaponized, and that's why you'll see them in the formations all this time. It's a trope of K-pop girl group videos. And so I actually worry that the increasingly visual and virtual society means more pressure to do the work of aesthetic labor and changing ourselves. But just as I don't think the response to fat phobia is for everybody to be skinny, and I don't think the proper response to homophobia is for everybody to be straight, I don't think the response to lookism, which is appearance-based discrimination, is for everybody to change themselves, to make themselves so-called pretty according to the standards of the day. We should actually be rethinking our notions of beauty and honor kind of the diversity that's inherent to the species and human experience, but also break the link between appearance and worth, because to look good does not mean necessarily that you're a good person, and to look bad doesn't mean that you're a bad person, right? And to do the work of looking good doesn't mean that you are hardworking, and to not do the work of improving your looks doesn't mean that you're lazy or incompetent. And yet those things, those ideas are so baked in to our understanding, and like beauty culture, I think we adhere to and don't really interrogate that much because it's so familiar. And so my work now, I think, in so much as that it's activisty, I'm not sure that it is, but like if I were to take any sort of activist role, it's for bodily liberation, for us to be able to exist however we're going to exist without having to pay a price.
Okay,
And the second part, yes, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, the second part on the process, the challenges. So much goes into the writing of a book from the very beginning up until the launch part, which I'm in now. The pre-writing, I think, is excruciating. So in order to sell a nonfiction book as a proposal and like get paid to actually write it, you pretty much have to have the entire table of contents worked out before you've done the reporting, which is a really backwards process. And I found that really difficult because I had to be able to stake a claim and say, these are the things that I'm going to write about. These are the questions that I'm going to be able to answer by the end of my reporting. And it ultimately, Flawless was a 40-page proposal. I think Jenna did see an early version of it. And what it was missing that wound up in the book, which is actually now one of my favorite chapters, was a chapter on aging. So there was a chapter on ajumas and halmonis and how to care for our bodies in a way that's really affirmative. And I think that older Korean women teach us a lot of great and sort of heartwarming and poignant lessons about that, that I didn't write about in the proposal. So the proposal part was hard. Sourcing, I worked with just excellent Korean researchers and translators as my right-hand women who were on the ground. And we talked a lot and mapped out based on the proposal and the chapters who would be the best voices to answer these questions, and who are the sort of regular folks, you know, the voices of regular people that can help us get into the story. Because I think the central compelling characters inside a story are really important. And so I would interview like 20 women and wind up quoting 3 of them. And so it was a lot more in the methodology, it was a lot more sort of like fanning out wide and then spending more and more time with the people who I thought could really help illustrate the point or the questions in the narrative.
Okay, we are
Yeah.
running out of time, so I think I'll go to Danny for one last question, and then Elise, if you have any final thoughts, feel free to kind of include that as well.
Yeah, so one thing I'm curious about is so I happen to know some people who work for Arirang and cover a lot of South Korean policies and whatnot. And there's definitely kind of this intentional push for K whatever, like K vaccine and K-pop, K culture, K beauty.
Just putting K dash in front of everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And it on the one hand, I think it is part of this broader push to export Korean products, right? Whether they're cultural or beauty or whatnot. But there is this kind of like nationalist sense to it. And also it seems to be like, once it has that K on it, it almost seems like it's a governmental imprimatur, like it's this official stamp of approval almost on whatever industry that's getting pushed. Do you see like, do you get a sense as the former bureau chief that the South Korean government was like pushing this industry as well?
Oh, of course. Of course.
Okay.
I mean, I in fact, I went to some of these expos where it was sort of like Invest in Korea expos, where K-beauty is a huge pillar of trying to export South Korea and its products and manufacturing to the rest of the world. Fun fact, the export volume of K cosmetics has now surpassed, as of last year, the export volume of Korean smartphones. So it is a massive industry. Korean cosmetics exports are now the world's 3rd largest, or Korea is now the world's 3rd largest exporter of cosmetics and skincare, just behind Europe, France, and the US. And so it's come up extremely quickly. The government is super supportive of this. It identified 10 countries for growth, like Chile, like Indonesia, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia in particular, to replace China as a market, because China is now shifting to more C beauty. And so K-beauty is a huge component and maybe underreported of the larger K- selling of the nation and that larger matrix. And I feel like the problem, you mentioned kind of the patriotism that's involved in that and the way that it's coded as like a state-sponsored thing. I feel like that makes it more difficult to critique too, you know, because K-beauty is part of the matrix of selling Korea to the rest of the world. There were a lot of sources who were sort of like, yeah, there's some downsides, but I don't want to diss my country. Whereas I never think like, if I challenge the American corn syrup industry, which I think has a lot of problems, or like sugar, okay, big soda, that I would be dissing my country. You know, so the way that these two things get conflated made it a little bit difficult for me. And then I'm also rather surprised, as soon as this book was announced, we were able to sell Japanese translation rights and simplified Chinese translation rights, but I've yet to sell Korean language translation rights. And I wonder if it's because this book is seen as subversive in Korea, even though it's a celebration of its women, I would argue.
Okay, Elise, thank you so much for joining us and staying a few minutes over as well. So we really appreciate your time. And I think Ekaterina put a couple of links, and Elise, you did too, put some links in the chat if you want to learn more about the book. And also, I believe you said today is the last day you can order a signed copy.
But tomorrow is the very last day to
Tomorrow.
order a signed copy. So wherever you are, if you order from that spot, they ship all over the United States, and you can personalize what you want me to write. So I'm happy to write those for you.
All right, thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us. We will have more information about our next webinar soon, so keep an eye on your inboxes. And in the meantime, join me in thanking Elise for her time.
Thank you all, and thank you so much for hosting and your interest in Korea. I share it, and so I'll maybe see you as an audience member in the next webinar. See you later.